very much. I'd like to start by thanking my warm-up man. Not bad, I thought. That was pretty good. Actually, when I first saw the program for today, it became abundantly clear to me that our principal function was to act as a safety zone, a safety buffer between Merrick and Eric, just a kind of a sort of demilitarized zone, if you like. I did also briefly consider changing my name to Derek, but I thought, no, okay. Right. Look, last year, something that worked quite well when we did the presentation was sharing some of our thinking and then getting some reactions from people kind of at the time in the bar and then over the kind of months after that. So we thought we'd share some thinking this year about some of our thoughts around developing commercialism in county councils, because I think the whole sector is figuring out what, if anything, to do with commercialism, and we thought it would make a good topic. Yes. Okay, so the shape of this is I'll be doing probably the majority of the talking, setting the scene and sharing some of the survey results that you kindly contributed to. Then Councillor Phil Battens will be sharing his thoughts as leader of a council which has already given a lot of thought to this area and has actually taken a number of very significant steps. Obviously, the man here from Capita, this session's going to be about outsourcing. No, it isn't. I mean, I know from a number of the comments in the surveys that a lot of people assumed that we were equating commercialism to outsourcing and that kind of thing. But no, we're not talking about outsourcing in this session. What we want to do is perhaps talk about some of the positive roles that may exist for commercialism within councils. We're interested in thinking about ways in which we can help with that, and we wanted to start a conversation. And in your delegate packs, you've got this thing. There's this little paper, what I wrote. And the idea of that, it goes into more detail in terms of the thinking that I'm going to present here and suggest some questions we could usefully be thinking about over the coming weeks and months. But in terms of, why are we talking about commercialism? Well, last year, those of you who were around last year may remember that we did a survey as to what were the kind of measures that people were going to take to combat austerity in the longer term. And one thing that had quite a lot of salience for a number of people was the idea of greater commercialism within the particular council. We asked the question again this year. It came out as basically the same sort of level. And I want to say, I suppose, that I know this can be quite an emotive topic for some people. There are some people for whom the kind of public service values and all of that kind of thing appears incompatible with anything that looks like the commercial world. There are some people who have those views. We know it from the survey. But there are other people, and there are other people who've looked at it and decided it's just not right for them because there are other things they can do. So really this is, I suppose, in a way, a conversation with the two-thirds of folk who can see some potential value in all of this. But I think it's also relevant for the one-third of councils who aren't going to be doing this to think about a landscape scrolling forward where two-thirds of councils are doing more kind of commercial activity and what that's going to look like. So if we get a sense of the scale of the importance of commercialism for councils, we asked you how important is significantly increased commercialism likely to be. I was slightly surprised to see that 6% of people said it was the single most important action they were going to take. And clearly there's 46% there of councils that are giving it a significant priority. But what is it? What is commercialism? What do I mean by that? Well, it's different things to different people, for a start. And what I wanted to do in this discussion was kind of give us a framework and a bit of a vocabulary for how we can actually talk about it. I think the other thing that's desperately important to say is that it's only a means to an end. You have a set of outcomes in terms of child safety, in terms of economic prosperity, educational attainment, whatever that sort of thing might be. So, it really is about a means to an end. And when we talk to people, there seem to be four themes. We've kind of grouped it into four themes of what people mean when they're talking about commercialism. So the first one is about making money in order to spend it on your priorities, whether that's protecting spend in an area, whether it's about doing the rewiring thing of reducing dependency on central government, or whatever. The second element that people often talk about is changing the culture. Let's make this council more business-like, and I'll come back to all of these in a minute. A third theme is about supporting commissioning councils. There's a growing groundswell behind commissioning councils, and we heard some really good stuff on that this morning, didn't we, in terms of the commissioning council. And then lastly, there's something about becoming more business-friendly. And we asked you which of these things were most important to you, and these were the percentages. So I'm now looking at the people who were interested in developing the commercialism idea. And roughly 3/4 of you cited the kind of business friendliness and making money as being important. 84% of you talked about the culture change thing. And there's an interesting little nuance in this one, in that across loads of the questions we asked, there weren't actually many differences between members and officers, but this is one where there was actually a statistically significant difference, with members being more likely to say that this was an important part of what was going on. The other last one then, at 90%, is supporting the Commissioning Council. And again, interestingly, there was a statistically significant difference, but the other way. So officers significantly more likely to rate this as being important than members. We can perhaps speculate on all of that later. Right, let's get into the 4 areas. And I want to start by talking about the first one, which is about the kind of making money. And we find that a useful way of thinking about this is to use this thing, it's called an Ansoff matrix, where basically you're looking at your kind of new and existing services that you sell to new and existing customers. And I'm partly doing this because I had a bet about getting a hip-hop gesture into this lecture. But the, sorry, silly digression. Right, so if you, it's kind of starting in the bottom left with the kind of existing, you're thinking about fees and charges and so on. In that sort of space, it's kind of doing more of the same. You can then go up a bit and think about doing new products and services for your existing customers. And you know, a little example there is Hammersmith and Fulham and the Starbucks in the library and so on. I was also struck in a conversation, I was in the session just now about adult social care, and I know that there are huge issues and problems coming up in terms of the welfare bill. But I think for an authority that wants to think of it that way, there are also some tremendous commercial opportunities in terms of being introduced to all of the self-funders, having them come to you even and announce themselves to you in that sort of way. The bottom right is obviously quite a common area. There's a lot of activity going on in terms of traded services at the moment, and that's quite an important thing. And you wouldn't necessarily expect to see things in that kind of new box, but those who were around for the CCN conference last year will remember Staffordshire telling us about a game that they developed for adults with learning difficulties in order to help them to articulate their life choices. And having developed that new thing for them, they're also taking that out now to new customers. So there can even be the more radical kind of new things up there. Now, the reason why this is potentially useful is that it gives a structure for thinking about the money-making activity. And each box on the grid needs different kind of commercial professional skills, and many of these are quite specialist skills. So obviously aligning what your aims are with the kind of support that you're getting is very relevant. But it's also very relevant in terms of thinking in each of these boxes, how are you going to win? You know, if you're going to compete in that space, how are you going to win? What are you going to do? Why are people going to come to you in terms of the sort of services that you're providing? And the kinds of questions that people are considering, and this paper thing that I mentioned goes into this in quite a bit more detail. But you know, almost all of that new activity is going to involve competing against someone. And it's going to mean an investment in people, an investment in marketing, and all of those sorts of things. Now, obviously, you're only going to do that if you're pretty confident there's a good business case and you're going to get a return out of it. But, you know, there is always risk. And there is therefore a chance that you'll have to be prepared to put some council taxpayers' money at risk. And some councils can do that. There is a political consensus around that, and some councils can't do that. And even for the ones that can, there's obviously it's a very easy shot potentially for the opposition or the press to complain about wasted money. So anything like that needs a lot of political resilience, I think, and obviously it needs results early on. It needs to work. A second thing, and we can expand on this later, but there's something about pricing information. We're finding that a lot of councils that have overcome that and you want to get out there are finding that getting the true cost of things in a pricing sense is quite difficult out of council financial systems that are designed for something else altogether. There's quite an important design choice about whether you're going to build your commercial capability by recruiting and growing your own, or whether it's going to be about developing a joint commercial relationship with the private sector. I mean, we've got I'm not doing a massive kind of Capita sales pitch today, but we have a number of examples of very successful joint ventures and other sorts of ways in which we're able to do that and work with councils so that we can bring the commercial and they can bring their particular knowledge and expertise. Another point which I wanted to put in, because I kind of don't hear it very often, you know, a private investor who is developing a new profit line would be thinking not just about the profit they're going to make while they develop the business, but they'd be thinking about their exit plan. You know, what are they going to do with it? You know, what's their plan for that organisation longer term? And some councils are thinking like that, but some aren't, and I think that's kind of quite interesting. And then lastly, there's this wonderful vexed question of competition. You know, do you want to draw a policy red line that says that you're not going to compete with local businesses? How do you feel about competing with other councils for work? And in a sense, how do you feel about competing with the local businesses of other councils. Maybe that doesn't matter. And I think that there aren't any necessarily right or wrong answers to that, but they probably need to be choices that are made explicitly rather than kind of accidentally, I suppose. So let's move on to the next one, which is about the change in culture, which was quite a popular one. I hear this a lot from people, kind of members and officers, who complain that compared to the private sector, or compared to their perception of the private sector, compared to the private sector, councils can seem slow and unresponsive and lacking in creativity and so on. But of course, many of the positive attributes of the private sector come because they are in a competitive market. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter if a private sector organization goes down, because there'll be others who can kind of pick up that business afterwards. Now, I've worked in the private sector and I've worked in councils, and councils are different, and I think it's worth, at the risk of telling you something that you all know really, really well, but I think it's worth teasing out here that local authorities are monopoly providers for a start in terms of a lot of the services. They're monopoly providers of essential services which are publicly funded, that are rationed politically. I know that's a slightly controversial, but they are, right? And democratically accountable. And if you think about the kind of governance and risk and consultation and so on that you're going to wrap around an organization that has those sort of attributes, it's pretty obviously not going to turn on a sixpence, is it? So I think that that's relevant. When I first made the transition into local government, I used to say to friends in my last company was that I would see something bonkers, and it would be difficult to tell whether I could change it by lunchtime or I had to change it by Act of Parliament, because the regulatory regime is obviously very, very different in that kind of situation. So my view here is that the cultural stuff needs to recognise that councils really are different. And I think if there's a problem holding back the entrepreneurialism, it's unlikely to be the staff, actually. It's unlikely to be the staff in themselves. Time after time when we're commissioned to take on a service and we bring the staff, we transfer the staff into Capita, we find that they blossom and become some of the best, most customer-focused innovators that we have. Sometimes those skills might be quite dormant in the sense of needing to be a bit of coaching or a bit of training or whatever. But they do that. And I think, the fleas do jump out of the jar in that sense, to take the analogy from this morning. And I think we saw some really good examples of that in the video from Cheshire West and Chester this morning, in terms of all of the new delivery models that they were trying and what that seemed to be unlocking within the people. One option that some councils have gone for is to create the trading companies, to create a bit of arm's length space in order that entrepreneurialism can happen there. And that seems to help, of course. But of course, if you're doing it at arm's length, it's less likely to feed back into the rest of the council. That's a few thoughts around the culture thing. Happy to continue that conversation in the bar or elsewhere. As part of the survey, we asked you about some areas, about the ways in which you were achieving greater commercialism. And there's a huge amount of rich data in that we're going to share properly with a kind of report, if you like. But I wanted to show just kind of one slide for now, because it provoked a thought in me, really. Now, what we're showing in this slide are a whole bunch of ways of achieving greater commercialism. We asked you if you had done it and didn't need to the extent that you didn't need to do any more. And that's the first kind of light blue line. And these are the top 5 things that people have signaled they've already done. So I thought, well, maybe these are the kind of priority ones in some ways. The purple bit is something where people have made a start, but they say they need to do more. The green is where they know that they need to do it, but haven't started yet. And then the ones on the end are various types of know and don't know, and so on. And one of the things I find quite interesting about this is the 2 that are about recruiting people, bringing in expertise for a fixed period, and recruiting people with relevant expertise on a permanent basis. Because as well as doing the market director role for Capita, I work with Veridus doing senior recruitment, interim and executive into some of these roles. And in a sense, the good news is that there's a very well-developed market for consultants and interim managers in terms of the helping to get things started bit. But I can tell you that the market for the permanent people, recruiting people with relevant expertise on a permanent basis, is much, much tighter. There are all sorts of issues in terms of people who can successfully make that transition, I think. And frankly, there's also an issue in terms of salaries and remuneration and so on there. And this is an area where that might kind of kick in a little bit, especially, I guess, since the 4th bar down is saying that there's relatively little appetite for thinking about changing the remuneration structures. On this one, I've been a little bit perverse, and I've taken off what the various initiatives are, because I just wanted to look at the colours for a minute. Because remembering what I was saying about purple being need to do more, green needing we need to start, there's an awful lot of purple and green on that slide. There's a huge work program there. And I think that's quite interesting. I also think it's interesting that clearly some of this commercialism is going to result in councils competing with each other, and therefore arguably the ones that can tackle that work program first are potentially the ones who are going to win in that sort of situation. I think he's arrived. Switch to script B. Right, no. So I'm going to be quicker with the next two elements, not just because he has arrived, but because there could be a bit of repetition in terms of what I'm saying. Oops, here we go. This next one is about supporting the Commissioning Council. And look, I did not invent the term Commissioning Council, okay? I know from the survey feedback that some of you really, really don't like the phrase Commissioning Council. I didn't invent it. But what I understand by it, what I understand by the notion of a commissioning council, is that there are some councils who very deliberately organise themselves in order to create a separation between commissioners who can be super intelligent buyers, who can really understand what the outcomes are that are needed, what the needs of the customers are, and so on, and who can best provide it. And then the providers who may be in the council and stay in the council and who have a mandate to be super efficient providers and potentially to actively market their services to other organisations. And whilst commercialism is obviously kind of hugely relevant for the provider side, it's most obviously relevant in terms of the provider side, and we do a lot of training for people in that kind of situation. I think there's also enormous scope. Commercialism is very relevant on the commissioner side as well, because there's some significantly skillful and strategic commercial thinking needed to create new markets, to create new options, to get the best from suppliers, and to do all of that in a way that isn't necessarily just about getting a cheap deal, but it's about achieving other council objectives as well, in terms of things like shaping the local market for employment and skills. 42% of you said that you were commissioning councils. A number of you said that you weren't commissioning councils, and the ones that said that they weren't were statistically more likely to say that they weren't going to be in future either. So it seems like a few people have kind of made up their minds there. And I also got one person who said, well, we are a commissioning council, but I'm going to say no because I refuse to use that label. So there we go. The joy of localism. It's wonderful. I love it. Okay, so lastly, this one tends not to be the first thing that people talk about when they talk about commercialism, but I think it's really important. I think people recognise the truth that if your council, if your staff are thinking more commercially, they'll be better able to ensure that your place is a good one to do business. They'll understand, I think, especially for small businesses, the heartbeat is different. You know, the cash flow, the continuing need for new customers, the fact that you'll have to lay off 3 people on Wednesday if you don't win the order on Tuesday. That's the life of a small business, and I think it can be very hard sometimes for council staff to appreciate that sort of thing. So whether it's about helping the small business to supply to the council, or whether it's about the council trying to encourage clusters of small businesses that can support each other, greater commercial awareness is bound to help. We've got Lord Heseltine talking to us tomorrow. I'm really looking forward to that. I found his speech to the LGA this year, which I guess a number of people will remember, was very, very stimulating, actually. And he was very, very clear, wasn't he, about the fact that councils and LEP areas are going to be in competition. And I think that there's something about bringing the kind of commercial thinking that helps companies that are in competition and applying that in the context of the sort of economic growth and the models that are being developed there. So anyway, that was a bit of a canter through what I wanted to say, really. And as I said, what I'm trying to do is put a little bit of a shape and a bit of structure to shape a discussion that we'd like to continue after today. I think that each council will have its own form of commercialism or not. I think we're all kind of figuring out what this is and where the kind of boundaries are. After the session I ran last year, a number of you invited me to come and have a longer chat with the senior team, and I think we all found that quite helpful. And as I said last year, I'm happy to do that, you know, for any council that's already a customer of ours. And in fact, all of the councils in this room, I've checked, are customers of ours for something. So that gives me all the justification I need. So part of the service, you know, I'll happily come and have a chat about this sort of thing. So please, let's continue the conversation. And specifically, let's continue the conversation now by hearing from Philip Atkins. Thank you.